Asia is just ahead of the rest of the world in terms of payments.
You only need your phone, your QR code, and it's so simple.
And when you look at it compared with the Western world, there is just not anything comparable at all. In the UK, for example, payment fintechs just don't exist. There is a space for something to really disrupt this.
I know you had this Disruptive Voices podcast in the past where you had a spotlight on women in tech.
We would always try and make sure we had a diversity of voices. So like in Africa in particular, there's so much innovation happening there, and there's so many women leading this as well. They're really finding these problems, these underserved people, and trying to find a solution for them. There is so much potential for change. Banks would argue that they could probably get efficiencies if they have AI doing the jobs rather than people. So this is going to mean that people are going to lose their job. You can't just let it take over. You need to have those checks and balances and that governance in there built in from the beginning, I think.
Welcome to the Pulse Check podcast, Kimberley Long. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You just flew over from the UK to Hong Kong. I'm sure it's a bit stuffy, hot, the heat, humidity, a bit different than UK weather, I guess.
We had a really good summer this year actually, but from the start of September the rain returned, so it's been pretty wet, but it's great to be back in Hong Kong. It's my first time here since pre-COVID, so it's a really great place. I'm really happy to be back.
And you just missed Typhoon 8.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
So, lucky you. No, thank you for joining us. And you probably already know that I started with an icebreaker, typically to get to know you better. So what's something that makes you, Kimberley?
So I guess with me, as a journalist, I think one thing that kind of makes me a little bit different is, so a lot of journalists, especially in the financial journalism world, are very much from a very particular type of background. They're often privately educated, they went to very fancy universities, their parents from a similar background. I'm not from that kind of background at all. So I'm from the northwest of England, which already makes me a little bit different. My parents kind of didn't do any exams, qualifications, and I just kind of knew from a young age I wanted to go into journalism, so almost doggedly pursued this path to end up here where I am now. So it was not so much something that was very set out for me. Like, people sometimes follow in parents' footsteps or have a very clear idea of what they want to do, but for me it was more that I always just wanted to do journalism, and this was something that I wanted to do. And I think that's what kind of makes me a little bit different within journalism, because I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle sometimes than other people. It gives you a slightly different approach to things. And this is something that I'm actually really passionate about as well, is kind of encouraging more people from these kind of underserved, in some ways, backgrounds to look at different career paths. And something that I try and do a lot of is actually working with my previous university, Sheffield University, where I did my journalism master's degree. I helped to tutor students there, and I also take part in a group called Speakers to Schools, and we'll go to secondary schools, typically around London, but it is across the whole of the UK, where we will give talks to students and tell them about kind of the opportunities that are out there to them that they may never have thought of before. So this is something that I'm quite kind of passionate about and want to really advocate for, to encourage more young people to really open up their horizons and think, actually, just because I don't know anybody who did this particular career, it can be a little bit more difficult in some ways, but these things are still open to them, and I think it really makes for a better industry to have more thoughts and more voices in it.
And interestingly, you cover basically also Asia as Asia editor for The Banker, Financial Times. And maybe you can quickly elaborate what brought you also to Hong Kong today. Why are you here?
Yeah, sure. So I'm here because we have our Banking Summit Asia, which is taking place tomorrow. So we have the Global Banking Summit in London, which takes place every December, which is a very well-established, very well-attended event. And we realised there was a real need to have something more Asia-focused as well. This is such an innovative and growing region that actually there was an awful lot we could cover here as well. So while the Global Banking Summit does cover Asia, it tends to be quite light touch because we're trying to get everything else in. But this is our first dedicated banking event actually in Asia. And it should be shaping up for a pretty good event, I hope.
Yeah, and looking forward to it, and great to have you in this opportunity. So maybe coming with the first question now related to the current trends in banking, and of course could be a global perspective, but also interesting what you see in Asia. So what can you share?
Yeah, I think it's interesting at the moment. There's a real kind of tension, I think, emerging in some ways, driven by kind of what's coming out of the US. You know, we have the tariffs impact. There is the uncertainty really based around what's going to happen next. And that in some ways I think is driving some decisions to be made about whether or not to focus more on Asia over looking more broadly towards the US. I think like sitting in London, that's something that I hear. And it's also, I think, in a way is driving more insular behaviour within Asia, because there is so much growth here in the region. It's such a diverse region. There are so many opportunities that I think there is potential for there to be more kind of developments within the region itself, which I think is really interesting. You know, I think, you know, you've got investors in different more developed markets looking and saying, what can we actually do within India? What can we do within Vietnam, for example? And that's really starting to grow out now. So I think there is a potential for a really rapid pace of change in some of these countries. And that is really then reflecting down to the banking space as well. There's a lot of conversation about kind of the correspondent banking networks, about how trade and supply chains are changing as well and how they are supported too. So if you are moving manufacturing into a new country, have you got the banking network there to support this? Is the infrastructure there to support it? If not, how do you invest in the infrastructure to bring it up to speed? So there's some real changes happening in the region. And I think in a way, almost some of the stuff that's coming out of the US is actually helping to provide a catalyst for this.
That's very interesting. And sitting in the UK in London and seeing also maybe a bit of the tension between the US and China, and for us in Hong Kong, this has been, of course, reality of the past few years. Of course, reality here might be a bit different to how it's perceived in Europe. So now you're also a bit in a tension with, of course, the US in the current political environment. With China, it's of course even a bit more exaggerated, but I actually see positive development that at least there's a conversation now, and this immediately had positive effect also on Hong Kong and China. And I also see, of course, this DeepSeek moment. I'm not sure how this was again perceived in Europe, but of course everyone was suddenly watching again what is also being done in China, not only the US. I mean, of course, AI, all the large language models that most people use are coming from the US, but suddenly there is also another player. So this definitely has an impact, and I would love to see how this then in your event is being also discussed and approached. But coming specifically more to also fintech, maybe the top fintech trends you see, be it in the UK and also in Asia, could be AI related or anything else you see and you want to share?
Yeah, I think for me with the fintech space, the one thing I've focused on for a lot of my career has been around the payment space. And that is where Asia is just ahead of the rest of the world. You know, you look at how apps like WeChat Pay, Alipay have just taken over in terms of payments in China. And, you know, across the region as well, there are so many. In South Korea, there's the apps, there's UPI in India. And when you look at it compared with the rest of the world, or the Western world, there is just not anything comparable at all. In the UK, for example, you know, payment fintechs just don't exist, really. You know, we will load our credit cards, debit cards onto our phones and use those to make payments, because I think there is this really entrenched idea about using credit cards, debit cards as a payment method that actually it's more difficult for these kind of apps to penetrate into the British market, at least. And then when you even look at like the US, I mean, the US is still very cash-based, and there's that proliferation of checks as well, which doesn't exist in the UK anymore. Like, I don't know anyone who's paid in a check for years, but, you know, it's still quite a big thing in the US. But I always think at least they have Venmo. You know, they can send money to each other quite easily, whereas in the UK, it's still very much on my mobile bank app, I still have to have all of my friends' bank details, and I have to text them and say, oh, is this still your bank number? And before I can send them money. So it's actually, it's a lot more difficult. It's a lot clunkier. And I do feel like there is a space for something to really disrupt this in the UK at least, but so far nothing has really managed it. I think some of the banks have tried to do this, but it's often been between accounts within the bank which, if you can't go between banks, then you're really limited in who you can do this with. But when we talk about the West as well, though, I do think it's interesting that in some places it has managed to evolve, like in Brazil with Pix. That's really taken off there. And it's not something that I've ever covered in detail, but it's a very interesting thing that there are these pockets of innovation that are happening kind of outside of Asia, but it's not really reaching the level like we're seeing in this region.
Yeah, what is interesting is I was just in Shanghai on the weekend, had a short trip. Mm-hmm. Came off the plane and I was in a hurry, so I didn't take any cash, renminbi. Anyway, rarely use cash anymore here.
Yeah.
And though I realized then, okay, I can actually not use my credit card in the taxi to the hotel. And of course, you can immediately use WeChat or Alipay. On the other hand, I just realized that I upgraded my phone, just bought a new phone. And then, of course, I didn't change in WeChat and added the new credit card. Of course, switching phones, meanwhile, is also much easier with the banks here. But then also in terms of activating also other currency, because I had to pay in renminbi instead of Hong Kong dollars. One bank I then tried to use as the payment provider underneath WeChat Pay. I'd immediately, it takes now 1 to 2 days to activate. So everything was possible to do online. I was doing my ID scan, my face scan and everything, but then 1 to 2 days to activate. I mean, complete no-go, right? The other bank, a virtual bank in Hong Kong, it was instantaneously. Yeah. So immediately activated, could pay the taxi and it was off, right? So you see that moment, you were sweating, you don't have cash and how do I even pay? All online, right? And that's something I love in Asia. I can go to Thailand, I go to Taiwan. It's either Line, WeChat, or any of these apps, or Grab, of course, in Southeast Asia. Yeah. And they work.
But then what is interesting from that is these have all developed as payment methods as like a secondary application.
I mean, in China, of course, it's all the main way to pay, but of course the problem is I don't have a bank account in China, yes, right? So that's why I had to activate first, of course, my Hong Kong banking accounts, and also if you use a credit card in terms of then also the currencies and so on, all these things are quite easy and straightforward, but are they instant? And of course certain banks, they can really do all of this instant. I mean, there's so many small things like, okay, suddenly you are somewhere in Bangkok. I was in a business dinner and suddenly realized that my credit card was suddenly blocked. Right? This happens all the time because suddenly you're in a different city. Yeah. Even though they could learn that I have an office in Bangkok, quite often they're not for personal interests, but really for business. And of course also exchanging then and so on, that's normal. But still they felt like, okay, something happened, you lost your credit card. Yeah. Obviously not the case. And of course, digital banks, newer banks that are well developed, you can immediately online just unblock your credit card. In one case with one bank, I had to call them, and then if it's late in the night, they have to somehow get their operations team to manually reflag or whatever. Yeah. And that's so amazing that you see these differences of how mature these banks are.
Yeah, I mean, and like with WeChat Pay, like I was in China. Again, it was like kind of the same trip I was last here, it's like 2019, and at that time I couldn't use WeChat Pay. I had WeChat because I would use it to communicate with contacts, but I couldn't use WeChat Pay. But then I was there last year and they had the ability then to load the foreign bank account cards onto it. So then I could suddenly use it and it did just open up everything for me. The only issue I had was trying to pay a taxi because I had to scan his QR code to be able to then pay, and we couldn't work it out, and it was one of those ridiculous things where he had his phone and he was trying to show me and I couldn't read the Mandarin, so we were trying to use Google Translate to work it out, and then we managed to do it in the end and it felt like a real victory. But the fact that is now possible is just real progress.
I'm a runner. I go run through cities wherever I travel, and suddenly maybe you don't have any cash with you, maybe not even a credit card, but you have your mobile phone. Mobile phone you always have on you, right? And now it's really so easy. So I'm a bit surprised that in Europe or US it's not exactly the same everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely just take your mobile phone out as long as you have, say, your debit card or your credit card loaded onto your phone, into your Google Wallet, if you use like an Apple. And then you can use that to make payments, but it's just not as integrated. It's not a fintech based application.
And not as simple with just scanning a QR code.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you can go to a small market where people just sell some basic stuff and they just have a QR code lying there. Right?
Yeah.
They don't need any infrastructure.
Yeah.
That's you only need your phone, your QR code, and it's so simple.
Exactly, and that's where I think with the app payments, where actually it's incredibly interesting and innovative, because often this has really bridged a gap of people who just didn't either have bank accounts or didn't have kind of access to the formal banking network, especially when you talk about huge countries like China and India, where people who live in quite remote areas, like, obviously in the cities you can use it, but actually it's really kind of fixing a problem in those areas. If people can't easily get to a bank, or if actually the process of getting to a bank itself can be prohibitively expensive if you have to take transport to get there. It's something that we who don't live in those areas really take for granted, that you can just walk to the end of the road and pay your cash at the end of the day into the bank. But actually some people don't have that. So it's really moved people away from being very cash-based actually into the more formal banking sector for the first time. And that then opens up so many new opportunities for them, because this is something that, you're really seeing to start develop now, is actually the maturity of these kind of payment systems, whereby it's moving away from just making a payment, making a transaction, into how can we develop this into the next generation of offering more complex products and services. So you're starting to see things like loans being offered to these very, very small SMEs, these kind of mom and pop shops, where somebody who maybe even literally has a tiny market stall and they've never had a bank account, they have no credit history, but they can use this payments history as their credit history and say, well, I can prove that I make X amount of money a day from these transactions. You can then loan me money based on this. And the understanding that I am earning enough to pay it back. And then suddenly people can buy more inventory, can upgrade their technology or facilities, and it's really opening up a new
that's a big
system
trend
for people.
in Asia, of course, started in China, absolutely, with Alipay and the whole loan origination process, and giving credit to the mom and pop shops. Exactly. So that's still a topic. I mean, even in Hong Kong, more, of course, very mature places, as a small business owner, the process can be very cumbersome and take weeks. And sometimes you cannot wait weeks. So it's really where innovation happens. And maybe also towards the next question. I mean, I know you had this also Disruptive Voices podcast in the past, where you had a spotlight on women in tech. I would be very interested to hear what were some of inspiring women that had their own fintech startup.
Yeah, this was really driven by the fact that often we would always try and make sure we had a diversity of voices, and there was a project for a while in the media in the UK, which was the 50-50 project, which was to try and make sure that as many women were being quoted as men. And this was across kind of the whole of the news media. It wasn't just financial media, it was everywhere. And what we would have to do was just really count how many voices we had, how many women we had quoted versus men. So in order to kind of balance out the playing field, you would then specifically ask, do you have any women who can talk about this? And sometimes you would get the answer of, oh no, there's no women experts. And you just think, I don't believe that. I don't believe that there isn't. So I took it upon myself with the podcast series to go out and find women, particularly in the fintech space, because again, that was like another level of trying to find women who actually worked in that area. But then when you start to look, you uncover so many, and you speak to one woman and she'll recommend somebody else. And
exactly.
For me as well, I really wanted to make sure that I was getting a really diverse, globally diverse section of voices too. So when I would do the episodes, I would always try to make sure that I kind of had a split across the geographies, so that I would be speaking to women from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, from Americas, because I wanted to make sure it wasn't just this idea that there was only women working in this space in kind of the West. Actually, no, like in Africa in particular, there's so much innovation happening there, and there's so many women leading this as well. And often the kind of problems that they're solving are the ones that are quite personal and quite, they are hitting things like supporting remittances, they are supporting SMEs, they are trying to help female entrepreneurs. they're really finding these problems, these underserved people, and trying to find a solution for them.
Which is actually interesting. I mean, of course, I come from Europe. I'm Swiss. And there was always a topic on, of course, the gender diversity in Switzerland. It's still an issue. We are a Synpulse 8, also tech engineering company where we want to find all talents. Here in Asia, it's very different. So, for example, in Thailand, there's so many women in tech, in banks. Also in China, I had also a few women in tech here on the podcast, Rebecca in AutoML. So it's a bit different here than I feel Europe, especially Switzerland, maybe a bit more traditional. I don't know the reasons. But here, definitely more diversity. And I, of course, if you also have a friend or a colleague, I would love to have also more, of course, on the podcast. But we had also a few. So thank you for also this inspiration. My last question goes, of course, now more into the future. I should have asked you, of course, after the event where you get inspired by everyone. But what are some of the top trends you see that could come up for the future or that are shaping the future of finance?
Yeah, I mean, AI, I think, is a thing that everyone's going to be talking about. I anticipate at the banking summit there's going to be a lot of talk around AI. And I think it's a really interesting topic. It's a really interesting time because there is so much potential for change, but it's actually doing change not just for change's sake. There is really interesting things that can be done. For example, like the personalization piece is something that's really being pushed by a lot of the banks now. It's kind of, we can dig into your data, we can find things, we can innovate, we can offer you very, tailored products and services, things like that. So there's this, this kind of really intelligent way of doing it. But then there's also the story around actually, is this going to impact employment? Is this going to mean that people are going to lose their jobs? I've heard stories around the people in banks who are using the AI tools to train up, and then actually the tools themselves become better at the job than the people. And there is this concern there. And, a couple of banks like DBS in Singapore have come out and said that they anticipate, how many jobs will be lost due to the use of AI rather than having people actually do it manually. So there is this kind of tension, I think, emerging as well, like where AI can be good and very innovative. And, I suppose banks would argue that they could probably get efficiencies if they have AI doing the jobs rather than people. But then also there's a huge regulatory aspect to this too, of the regulators wanting to be able to see that paper trail. They want to see the decision-making process. Just saying the AI told me to do it is not good enough. So there needs to be these kind of checks and balances built in as well. It's not simply just let the AI do the job and run away with it. So there's a lot to discuss around it. There's so much potential that can be unleashed through using AI, but using it in a really productive and responsible way. You can't just let it take over. You need to have those checks and balances and that governance in there built in from the beginning, I think. Yeah,
in a highly regulated environment like banking, of course, you need the checks and balances. You also need the senior experts, compliance officers that, of course, can really judge. I mean, it's a non-deterministic algorithm that gives you data to make a decision upon. So obviously it's not always or is never correct. It's not supposed to be, and you need to be able to judge. So what I see also in our company and with our clients is that there is the trend towards having experts supported by AI, which even in software development means, of course, a senior architect, senior software engineer, of course, is still highly sought for. But he then uses AI instead. You send maybe some of the coding to India, Philippines, offshore, plus also the more junior roles where you don't have yet that experience may be replaced earlier, which raise the question on what happens to all the fresh graduates.
Yes, this is a real question about if you're going to replace the very bottom level with AI, then who is going to gain the experience to then pass up to the next level? So that's a real question. And then there is also the debate as well around actually finding the talent for these roles. They want not just somebody who can do the coding, kind of, know how to use the AI, but really understand how to interpret what AI tells them. There needs to be really specialized trained people who know how to do these roles. And it's such a nascent technology that actually there isn't really that many people out there yet. It's something that really needs to be scaled up. But when you speak to banks, this is something that they say is that actually they're finding issues with hiring the talent that they need to fill these roles now. So there is that potential there that might actually slow down some of the AI development, is because there aren't the people there who can develop it and interpret what it's saying in an effective way.
I'm a firm believer that everyone needs to upskill, otherwise you're the first one to be out of job.
Yeah.
So even myself, as part of the leadership of our company, so we have to start at the top. Thank you so much for your insights. Before we close off, of course, is there anything you want to share on top? Where can we find you?
Yeah, so I mean, you can find me on LinkedIn, on Kimberley Long. You can also find me on Blue Sky. We kind of had a mass migration of journalists to Blue Sky a little while ago, so it's still quite a small community there, but that's where I kind of post a lot of the stories, and I post a lot of the kind of more random things that I get up to as well. I'm sure there'll be some photos from this 10 up on there as well at some point.
Looking forward to it then. So thank you once again. Of course, if you find Synpulse 8 Pulse Check podcast on YouTube, LinkedIn as well, and Spotify. And I hope, of course, to see you again, or maybe next time I'm in the UK and the UK weather, and we have the opposite conversation.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.